Thank you. And I have about 10 minutes, and I've been asked to talk about the state's response to trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation. Yeah, okay. And I suppose the first question is to look at what we actually know. This is a hidden crime. It's particularly heinous because it's based very often on deception, and deception of some of the most vulnerable people who come to Ireland. If you look at the figures for the past few years, in 2017 we had a total of 72 recognised victims, 42 adult females and 3 girls. And of those, 28 were trafficked for sexual exploitation. In 2018, the total number of recognised victims went down to 64. So 30 adult females and 3 girls, and of those, 26 for sexual exploitation. And in 2019, the most recent figures that are available, the total figure went down again. 42 total recognised victims, 31 adult females, 7 minors, and 34 for sexual exploitation, and 2 for both sexual exploitation and forced labour. So we see a downward trend, which we're not quite sure why that's happening, in the total number of victims that are recognised, but the number of women and girls who are trafficked for sexual exploitation remains very much the same. And our concern is that this really doesn't get at what's happening in our society. There were 650 women advertised online each day. It's a finding in the very recently published SERP report. And we also have not evidence, but sort of anecdotal evidence of about 2,000 women engaged in prostitution, most of them not Irish, and very few involved in the sex trade in any genuine way of their own free will. We know that in the European Union, some 56% of trafficking victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation, and our official figures, again, subject to not being sure that this is a full reflection of what's happening in our society, show a much higher proportion of victims in Ireland were trafficked for sexual exploitation. So next slide, please. There have been some significant reforms over the past few years. The Criminal Justice Act 2017 criminalises the purchase of sex, and that gives a really important message to our society and to men and boys who might wish to purchase sex. This is not appropriate, and it's based on the understanding that prostitution in Ireland is inextricably linked in with human trafficking and exploitation of the most vulnerable. There's an independent review being conducted by Maura Butler, formerly of the Law Society, and currently with the ACJRD, which is underway, and we would expect that to be completed sometime in the new year. Another significant development over the past few years is the establishment of the Garda National Protective Services Bureau and Divisional Protective Services Bureaus, and there's one in each Garda division since September, and that represents a shift to support and protection for victims and for women engaged in prostitution. There's also been a significant shift in terms of using the Criminal Asset Bureau processes to get at the money. And during COVID-19, An Garda Síochána had dedicated communication channels to women engaged in prostitution by way of providing support and help. Next slide, please. Other things that we're doing, again, I said this is very much a hidden crime. Concern is that the official figures we have are not a true reflection of what's happening in society, and there's work to be done in terms of changing attitudes, and work to be done in providing effective support to very, very vulnerable and traumatized victims who find it very difficult to trust and to approach An Garda Síochána or other official agencies. We've established a high-level group on which the Department, An Garda Síochána and the DPP are represented. And the purpose of that group is to keep the system, to keep legislation and to keep practice in investigations and so on under review, and to identify changes in legislation or other actions that would benefit in terms of better support for victims and more effective investigations and ultimately successful prosecutions for human trafficking or for related offences. We've appointed the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission as our national rapporteur under Article 19 of the EU Directive, and this will give an independent, authoritative voice that reviews the situation in relation to human trafficking in the state and reports periodically to the European Commission and to other international bodies, but particularly to the European Commission. As Nusha said, we've established a forum for stakeholders which builds on consultation mechanisms that existed in the past. And again, the objective is to make sure that there's a wide range of expertise involved in looking at the situation in relation to human trafficking in Ireland and seeing what we can do to improve our performance in terms of identifying victims, providing support, providing exit paths and prosecutions. Two specific initiatives that are being examined is that we have agreed with the IOM to fund the International Organisation for Migration Office in Dublin to employ cultural mediators to work with suspected victims of human trafficking, and in that way to act as a bridge between people who, as I said earlier, will perhaps find it very, very difficult, given their background, to trust the police or to trust other official bodies, will find it very difficult to understand the system here with the language barriers and coming from a very different cultural background. Secondly, An Garda Síochána are examining the possibility of introducing an initiative that's found in the United Kingdom, the Navigator Initiative. Essentially, that would involve trusted NGO partners who are involved at the very stage of a criminal investigation or a raid on a brothel to support the victim. And the purpose of the Navigator is to be there at the very start to support the victim and to do that separately from the Garda job of gathering evidence for a prosecution. And moving on then, another initiative that's close to finalization is the provision of dedicated accommodation for those within the asylum and protection system who are victims of human trafficking. Concern is that it is inappropriate to keep victims in accommodation where the possible traffickers or other people from within their ethnic group, their migrant group, are also accommodated. And this is part of the reform announced by the government to move away from a procurement system and towards an accommodation system that's based on partnership with housing associations and NGOs, and also improves the quality of accommodation that's available, moving to own door units, moving to family units, and so on. The responsibility for this action transferred recently following the formation of the new government to the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, and they are very close to finalising an agreement with a specific NGO to provide a suite of specialist accommodation for female victims of human trafficking. Next slide, please. One of the more significant reforms that we're working on currently is to put a revised national referral mechanism in place. Currently, the sole authority for formal recognition of victims of human trafficking is An Garda Síochána. Again, previous speakers mentioned, Nusa mentioned, that isn't necessarily the most appropriate mechanism, and certainly An Garda Síochána think it's inappropriate that they would have the sole responsibility. This is a responsibility of a wider group of agencies. So we want to involve all the relevant other agencies in decision making, and are negotiating with the key bodies at the moment before putting a proposal to government, hopefully before the end of the year. We want to move away from a system where it is only on Garda Síochána that can formally recognise a person as a victim of human trafficking, to a system where there's a range of other agencies who have that role, and that would allow different pathways to recognition, a committee structure as a clearinghouse, each agency having its own, obviously, due diligence investigation process, but allowing us also to separate out immigration issues, questions of being part of a prosecution and giving evidence from being formally recognised as a victim and getting access to the services that a person, context this webinar, looking at women who have been trafficked into prostitution, giving time for that person to build up the self-confidence and trust in authority figures. The long-term objective, of course, is to go after the traffickers, but the first priority is to protect the victim, take the victim out of the situation, and then provide long-term support to allow, as I said, the victim to build up self-confidence and trust where they might be willing to be part of a prosecution and to give evidence. And we're also looking at the possibility of having particular NGOs designated as trusted partners in the National Referral Mechanism, on the basis that we know that, and I won't name any of them, that some NGOs are doing really good work in this area and have built up a network of contacts, and do have that initial credibility that state agencies won't have in dealing with somebody from a different cultural background, or somebody who has been traumatized and doesn't know where to go to seek help. Next slide, please. And I'm coming to the end of the presentation. In terms of future challenges, the future and challenges, training is an issue. We need training not just for members of Garda Síochána, but for other frontline staff and for legal professionals and so on. We also need greater awareness of this crime in our society, not just amongst the small percentage of men who purchase sex, but amongst people who are part of the criminal justice system. We're not quite there yet in terms of making the link between purchase of sex, for example, and human trafficking. The We Don't Buy It campaign has been really important and really useful in terms of raising awareness, but there's an awful lot more to be done. There are still lack of awareness and attitudes in our society that we need to tackle. I mentioned earlier that we need to put long-term support systems in place for victims and exit routes. The objective is, as I said, to go after the perpetrator, but the first priority is to support the victim and to take the time and to provide the support for long enough to build up that trust and self-confidence. Questions that we need to look at include provision of income maintenance and housing and immigration issues for women who are seeking to exit prosecution. We've had no successful prosecutions for human trafficking. This is a really difficult crime to prosecute. There have been cases, including cases that collapsed when they were actually before the court, when the victim, I suppose, realised how traumatic it was going to be and how difficult it was going to be to give evidence. Successful prosecutions have included prosecutions under the 2017 Act and cases that were successful taken by the Criminal Assets Bureau. There have also been successful prosecutions for organising of prostitution, but the numbers are quite low, so there's an awful lot more that needs to be done there. One of the things we're doing currently, as I mentioned, we have a high-level group with ourselves and Garda Síochána, the DPP, so we're looking at how the legislation or the procedures in terms of implementing the legislation might be strengthened, and discussions are ongoing as to how that can be done in a very formal way in terms of looking at what we have and strengthening procedures and possibly strengthening the provisions in the legislation. And finally, we have a 2016 Human Trafficking Action Plan, and one of the issues before the stakeholders forum for next year is the question of reviewing that action plan, which is 4 years old at this stage and could benefit from being reviewed.
There is a question that was put to Deaglán O Briain in relation to accommodation of victims of trafficking. I think Deaglán covered this in his presentation to an extent, but if he wants to share any further comments on this, Deaglán, please feel free.
Talking to myself. I don't have a role in relation to the direct provision system, but I certainly would not disagree with the opinions expressed by CEDAW and by the Grevio committee. And for that reason, my colleagues in the Department of Children Equality and so on are close to finalising arrangements for special accommodation for female victims of human trafficking, and precisely for the reasons set out in the question, given the trauma that they have suffered, the possibility of proximity otherwise to people who may have been involved in their trafficking. So that is something we're going to do.